This is my presentation for Research Project Assignment 3, which is reviewing our Research Project 2, which was the investigation. I will begin with looking at the aims and objectives that were set for the research task. I will be looking at each aim and objective to see whether or not they were achieved. My first aim was to define the shooting accuracy in fouls committed for Arsenal and the work rate of Aaron Ramsey. When looking back over my project, I can see that I did achieve this objective. I can see this from looking at the reference definitions that I researched for regarding shooting, fouls and work rate. In order to find the correct definitions and achieve this aim, I used the course textbook and searched for good definitions on Google. By doing this, I would be able to find enough information and could search for the best reference definition that was available. Due to this, my work would be better because I had a clearer understanding of what each criteria was. By having a better understanding when watching the game and recording all of the data on Dartfish, I would be able to determine the difference between an intentional shot or a misplaced pass, for example. This would make my results a lot more reliable and accurate because I haven't misinterpreted parts of the game, so will have recorded it correctly. The evidence to support that I have achieved this aim can be seen on the PowerPoint, and it is the 3 definitions that I referenced in my project. My second aim was to design a notational analysis system to compare 2 performances by Arsenal and Aaron Ramsey. This aim was also achieved, and the evidence for this can be once again seen on the current slide. On the slide you can see an image of the buttons created on Dartfish to help analyse the events from the game. There are event buttons to identify a shot or a foul, which were a key part of what I wanted to investigate. There are keyword buttons for every player who participated in both games, as well as buttons for each type of shot that was taken. I also created keyword buttons for different areas of the pitch, which half the event happened in, such as first or second. For shooting, I also had buttons that would allow me to see whether the shot was successful or unsuccessful. By having all of these buttons, I could easily compare the results from each game. This is because I could compare a number of different things from what players shot the most in both games and who had the most accurate shooting. I could easily look at the notational analysis and identify these differences or similarities in the data. I could also look at where Arsenal had most success from regarding shooting or where they are most vulnerable in giving away the most fouls. Due to all of this data, I can easily identify Arsenal's strengths and weaknesses that would help me in the discussion section of my project. There are also continuous event buttons that were made to measure the time Aaron Ramsey spent walking, jogging or sprinting. Once the data had been collected from both games, I could then put the data into Excel to create different charts. This enabled me to properly compare the work rate of Aaron Ramsey from 2 different games to see which one he worked harder in. I could then look into the results and see why he worked harder in one game than the other, for example. My third aim was to compare the shooting accuracy in fouls committed for Arsenal and the work rate of Aaron Ramsey. This aim was also achieved, and the evidence of this is on the slide in the form of a chart made from results from each game. Although these graphs can't be compared to each other because they are about different things, I made the same graphs using the same sets of data, but from each game that I analysed. For example, you can see that graph 1 has the successful and unsuccessful shots from the different areas of the pitch on it. This was from the first game that I analysed. I also created a graph using successful or unsuccessful shots and pitch areas, but using the data from game 2. This is the same for every graph that I made so that I could have the same categories of data from each game to see which game was better or worse. These graphs can be seen in the results section of Research Project 2, which I will show in a minute. This made achieving the aim of comparing the shooting accuracy in fouls committed and work rate much easier. This is because I could look at the graphs from each game and compare the results within them. This made analysing the strengths and weaknesses of the 2 performances very easy because of how clearly laid out the data was. The graphs also allowed me to quickly make points of which game was better, and when looking at shooting accuracy, fouls and work rate whilst using the data that I had collected to support my point. This made sure that my explanations and suggestions were correct based on the data collected from the games, because I would use the data as evidence to support my points rather than just saying random things. I'll now show you the evidence of the graphs. So here we can see all of the different graphs that I'd created to enable me to compare my work. I'll also show you the discussion section, which is the evidence for my next aim. So in here, all of this supports that I had completed the next aim, which I'll go on to speak about now. Aims 4 and 5 have been put on the same slide because they can be backed up by the same piece of evidence, which is the discussion section of my research project 2, which is what I've just shown on screen. Aim 4 was to analyse 2 performances of shooting accuracy and fouls committed for Arsenal and the work rate of Aaron Ramsey. Aim 5 was to discuss 2 performances of shooting accuracy and fouls committed for Arsenal and the work rate of Aaron Ramsey. Both of these aims were achieved because I completed the discussion section of my project in good detail and depth. In this section I used the data collected to gather similarities between the two from the 2 games. For example, the most common type of shot used in both games was a power shot. By looking at these similarities and differences, I could easily identify strengths and weaknesses of the performances and the team. This allowed me to provide future recommendations for the team that would help to improve their performances as individuals and as a team. Due to this, I will have analysed the performances and achieved Aim 4. I also achieved Aim 5 because I looked at both sides of each game, such as the strengths, weaknesses, similarities and differences. With all of this information that I had collected from each game, I could discuss the results and look at the positives from each game and what they mean for the performance. By looking at the positives, I could identify and explain the benefits that these actions had and why they would help the team perform better and have a better outcome. I also looked at the negatives of the performances, which led to making future recommendations for the team in order to improve their overall performance. I will now go on to speaking about the strengths of my research project. The first strength was how I managed my time throughout the whole project. I finished coding for both games earlier than originally planned. Once the coding was done, I could begin to gather my data and put it into charts to use for comparing the 2 games. By getting all of this data prepared and set up quickly, I had more time to interpret the data. Having a lot of time to do this allowed me to look at every piece of data to get a good understanding of what it all means. Due to this understanding and knowledge of the data collected, I was able to spend a good amount of time identifying similarities, differences and future recommendations. This made all of the points that I made more accurate to the data that was actually collected. I could also look through the data and find bits of it to back up my points. By looking at the data in depth and looking for the similarities, differences and future recommendations that I had initially made, I could still look at alternative suggestions because I had time left, because the coding didn't take that long. Also, because of the time, once I had finished coding, I was able to properly investigate different methods to suit my future recommendations. For example, one future recommendation I made was to keep possession and wait for a good chance to arrive rather than wasting chances and shooting from the edge of the box. As I had a lot of time, I could do a thorough search about the importance of keeping the possession. This allowed me to find the correct evidence to support my suggestion, making it more worthwhile and proven to actually help improve performance. Having good time management helped my research project reach a high level of quality and depth because I had the time to fully investigate and look into my project rather than rushing parts and making it brief with little reasoning behind the suggestions. If the suggestions were not in depth and were rushed, then they would be inaccurate and wouldn't be backed up by journals or articles. However, as I did have time, all of the points that I made were backed up with data from games that I analysed or from research done online from journals and articles. Due to this, my project is more reliable and related to the actual performances of Arsenal, making the project more useful to others if they were to look at it. My second strength was the planning that I did for the whole project such as completing my research proposal correctly and in a lot of detail. By doing the research proposal well, I was able to plan elements of my research project, such as the overall aim of the study, and I set objectives that I wanted to achieve. In my proposal, I also looked at different things that I would have to consider, for example, who may be interested in using my study once it is completed. By doing this, when it came to completing my project, I was able to base my work on who it would benefit, such as making future recommendations that coaches may find useful in the future. I could also plan and get an understanding of how I was going to collect the data during my research. I looked at using computer or hand notations. I looked at the positives and negatives of each method, and this allowed me to make gathering notations easier when it came to doing it because I already planned what I was going to do. I decided to do computer notations, and because I planned well, it made using Dartfish a lot easier because I already had planned to use it, so I could look at the program beforehand to get a feel for how to use it. This made my coding quicker because I could easily set up the notational analysis system to gather the data from the games. Other considerations that I put forward during my proposal was regarding the validity of the data. For example, having 2 games in 2 different seasons could mean Arsenal using a different formation. One may be more attacking and one may be more defensive, therefore leading to have a different amount of shots that would happen in the game. By looking into this during the planning phase, when I came to look at and compare my data, if there was a significant difference, I would have a slight idea as to why this could have occurred. I could then speak about this in the differences section and explain why. As I had already planned it, explaining it later on would be much easier and convenient because I would have been expecting something like that to occur and would have been prepared. Another good thing about my planning and preparation was how early in the project I found 2 games to analyse and got them downloaded onto a memory stick for safekeeping. I had enough time before I had to start coding the games to find 2 good quality games that had sound and a good image. Finding games with these things is good because it makes it easier to identify what has happened and who had done it. For example, I would be able to see the player that took the shot or committed the foul because the quality of the video would be good enough. I could also hear commentary that would also say what is happening in the game, so I would know exactly what was happening. Due to this, I would be able to get more accurate results and make better recommendations from the data that I was able to collect. My final strength was how well I knew the sport that I decided to do, and I also chose the football team that I support and a player that I know well from the team. As I play football, I have a good knowledge and understanding of different tactics and how they would affect the game. Also, when looking at the data, I would be able to get better similarities, differences and future recommendations. This is because I would be able to interpret what the data means more easily due to my knowledge of football. This also made explaining the points much easier because I knew why it would be good for performance or how it would hinder performance and why it is important to make a specific change. This made my work more reliable because it is based on knowledge of the sport rather than assumptions from someone who doesn't understand the sport as well. Also, when I was making future recommendations, I was able to highlight the weakest areas of Arsenal's performances that created them the most problems and hindered performance the most. I was able to do this because I would know which weaknesses are most important to improve and that could be most detrimental to performance. Once making the future recommendation, I would also be able to give a detailed way of how this recommendation could be achieved.